Good morning, everyone. Depending on which time zone you're in, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Decarbonizing the Shipping Sector and the Potential Role of LNG in Hong Kong webinar, organized and hosted by Business Environment Council, or BEC. I'm Wayne from BEC's Policy and Research team. Before we begin, a note to participants that today's seminar will be recorded and later uploaded to BEC's YouTube channel. The video link and presentation slides will also be sent to you after the webinar. Please feel free to use the Q&A and chat box functions located at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for our speakers, please type your questions using the Q&A function, and we will address your questions at the panel discussion near the end of this webinar. On behalf of BEC, I would like to express our gratitude to our supporting organizations for this event, the Hong Kong Liner Shipping Association and the Hong Kong Shipowners Association. This webinar is first of a two-part webinar series on LNG bunkering, and it is also a part of BEC's research and engagement project on the use of LNG bunkering in Hong Kong. Today, our speakers will provide a strategic overview of the use of LNG regionally and locally in Hong Kong and its benefits. The second webinar, preliminary scheduled at the first quarter of 2021, will be geared towards regulatory measures and strategic recommendations on LNG bunkering in Hong Kong. Please stay tuned. Finally, I would also like to thank Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for supporting this webinar series. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Christian Huebner, Head of Regional Program, Energy Security and Climate Change, Asia Pacific, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, for his opening remarks. Christian, please.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Regional Project Energy Security and Climate Change, Asia Pacific of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, it's a pleasure and honor to wish you all a very warm welcome to this important event on decarbonizing the shipping sector and the potential role of LNG in Hong Kong, organized by the Business Environmental Council. Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing 5-year Paris Agreement, and although the crucial challenges of global pandemic, the global climate protection ambition still increased this year. The EU made out of a Green Deal, a Green Recovery Agenda. China, Japan, and South Korea, amongst others, announced carbon neutrality target this year, and the implementation of carbon pricing all around the world is extending, especially in Asia Pacific. Decarbonization, therefore, is affecting many industry and sectors, especially now as well the shipping sector, which might be one of the newest in this context. Well, I'm not going much more in detail into what does this mean for the shipping industry and what role LNG might have in this context. That's something we are going to learn today from the outstanding experts who are going to join us and share their knowledge with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really looking forward to listen to our speaker, who I would like to thank for sharing the time and knowledge with us. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this event and would take this opportunity to thank again the Business Environmental Council for organizing this important dialogue. And with this, I give it back to the BEC. Thank you.
For the 15 minutes allotted. International shipping, 55,000 ships, basically responsible for 2% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. The challenge is that basically international shipping needs to meet the 40% reduction in carbon intensity by 2030 and 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. How we're going to get there? Well, the IMO has just completed its 4th greenhouse gas study, and in a sort of small summary, that basically is 90% of the goods shipped around the world are shipped by sea, And as you can see, shipping is increasing. In 2008, 8.4 billion tons shipped. 2018, 11 billion tons shipped. Also, there's quite a lot of discussion about how shipping actually, how much of greenhouse gases shipping actually has. And if you have international shipping and domestic shipping, it's responsible for 2.9%. But actually, domestic shipping is covered by the Paris Agreement, because basically each country has to commit to the Paris Agreement, and their domestic shipping does that. And just as an example, China has 200,000 domestic ships. So that's a very considerable number, although quite a lot of them are very small. So what we're talking about today is international shipping. So international shipping, they've had some reductions, a 30% reduction between 2008 and 2018 on the tons per move per 1 kilometre. And that's been done by basically slowing down ships and having larger ships. But the cargo moved continues to increase. So this is a complete challenge for the future. The other issue is that came out of the greenhouse gas study was that 5% of the greenhouse gases have reduced despite a 40% increase in maritime trade over the same period. So that's quite a good number. And it basically shows that the CO2 emissions of shipping has decoupled from the global growth. So that's encouraging. This graph basically shows the increase in billion-ton miles of shipping since 2000 to 2019. And you can see it's quite substantial. 30,000 billion-ton miles in 2000 and 60 billion-ton miles in 2019. And this is unlikely to stop. So you can expect this to carry on as world globalization continues and countries increase their wealth and more trade occurs. So the challenge is, how on earth is shipping going to meet its challenges for lower greenhouse gases when we've got an increasing amounts of cargo being shipped around the world? Well, the IMO has basically looked at this problem and in 2018 agreed a roadmap to get to the ultimate goal of zero emissions from shipping. And they basically divided into short, medium and long-term measures. Now, at the moment, we're in the short-term measures area, and they've just completed MEPC 75 in end of November. And at that meeting, it was finally decided there was three things which basically were agreed. One is that ships basically built before 2013, when the EEDI came in for design of new ships, those ships which didn't have EEDI now have to meet a new measure, which is basically similar to an EEDI, which is called an EEXI. I'll explain about this in a minute, a bit more detail. Also, they agreed on a ship energy efficiency management plan, and they've also agreed to have carbon index reduction measures. So these are quite substantial. They will be coming in from the 1st of January 2023. The next ones to do are the midterm. Now, they're already talking about midterm because basically we're talking about market-based measures. We're talking about how to obtain lower carbon fuels and also to increase the efficiency of ships. And the longer term measures, which are basically between 2030 up to 2050, that is about basically using low and zero emission fuels and how basically to get there. So there is a plan. You could say that the IMO is possibly a little bit slow, but they're slow and steady, and they're increasingly being pushed to speed up. So what was agreed in November 2020 was, I've just mentioned, the EEXI. That is a very substantial move for improving the efficiency of earlier ships, particularly ships which weren't built as efficiently as the current ships. The Shipboard Efficiency Energy Plan, well, ships have them at the moment, but they're not mandatory. And in future, they will be mandatory and they'll be part of the ISM, and they'll be surveyed every year. Now, this is important because this is a trading certificate. If the survey is not passed, the ship will not be able to trade. So this is actually quite a substantial move, and it will mean that ships will be stopped from trading if they don't meet the energy efficiency plan. The other issue is the carbon reduction index. That is basically to improve ships on a steady basis and basically push ships to meet higher efficiency standards over a period of time. And that will start from 2023, but it won't really have any teeth and become mandatory till 2026. But when it does, it will probably increase every year, and it'll keep on increasing every year. There's no end to it. So you can expect that ships will become much, much more efficient and will have to be more efficient in future. The other one is the EEDI. That was agreed to move to phase 3 for container ships from 2022. That's basically now 30% below the base level when it was first introduced in 2014. Bulk carriers and tankers have to meet this in 2025, which will be quite challenging. So, sorry, move too fast. Sorry. Yeah, basically this is a quick little diagram showing you basically if you have an inefficient ship which burns more CO2, the only way it can compete with efficient ships is to slow down, which makes the efficient ship more attractive to a charterer, and it can earn obviously more money. This is a small graph produced by the IMO. It just shows you the challenges to meet the 2050 requirement for 50% reduction in greenhouse gases. The blue, the design and technical measures, EEDI, EEXI, etc. The orange are the operational measures, and the green, and you can see that the blue and the orange do not get down even to the level where we were in 2010. So we have to get down to the 2050. The only way we can do it is basically using low emission fuels. And this graph basically gives you an illustration of which fuels will be used up to 2050. And that you can see the change, the vast change between 2020, 2050. The yellow is basically oil, marine gas oil and low sulfur fuel. And as you can see, it's going to be decreasing fairly rapidly, and it's going to be overtaken by the blue, which is LNG. Just between the yellow and the blue is a very dark blue side, and that is hydrogen. So you can see that hydrogen is going to start, but it's not reckoned to be taken off hugely, because it's basically one of the reasons is because ships have quite a long life. Normally they last at least 20 years, quite often 25 and some even 30 years. So a ship built today, 2020, could last for another 30 years until 2050. So that is the reason why we're still going to be using oil at 2050. And that's the reason why hydrogen isn't going to take off so greatly, because that won't happen until mid-2030 or even 40. But it does also show you the other things that are going to take off, and that is ammonia, which is red at the bottom. That is likely to become more popular than hydrogen. So this is just, of course, an estimate and being produced, and of course it may not happen exactly like this, but this is as best we can do at the moment. Showing that LNG is one of the major future fuels. This is a graph, or rather a table, which basically shows you the energy, specific energy and the energy density of various fuels. And from this, just looking at the first two, which are oils, heavy fuel and MDO. And then your next one is LNG. And what you can see is that LNG has a slightly higher specific energy, megajoules per kilogram, than oil, but the energy density is less. What that means is that basically, if you had a ship which, normal ships can usually have tankage on board, which enables them to travel at least 15,000 nautical miles. So if you had the same tankage for LNG, it would need to be 1.6 times the size. Now, the problem with that is that you're going to have less space for cargo. So one of the factors with LNG is probably you're going to have to bunker more frequently, because you will not want to increase the tankage and carry less cargo. So LNG, to become popular, needs to have many areas where you can bunker. That's an important factor. Now, Clarkson's has just come out with some quite interesting information. This is published in TradeWinds on the 4th of December. Basically telling you about how many LNG ships there are around at the moment. Now, excluding LNG tankers, they claim there's 227 LNG dual fuel ships on order, and there's 202 LNG ships trading at the moment. And the largest numbers are tankers, currently 34, and 72 on order. Ferries, another one, 50 in service, 24 on order. Container ships are slightly lower, 11 in service, 30 on order. The offshore, well, there's quite a few there, but they're smaller ships anyway. But cruise ships is quite interesting. 7 ships in service, but 28 building at the moment, plus another 54 other types of ships. The other issue is that there's actually LNG bunkering possible in 127 ports around the world, up from 114 at the start of 2020. Now, most of these ports, the LNG can only be delivered by truck, which is very slow. So that is not really feasible for large ships to be bunkered by trucks. They need to have special bunkering ships, similar to the bunker ships which are used for bunkering oil at the moment. So the bunkering fleet is expected to double by the end of 2022, which is good news. Now, LNG, though, is recognised only as a transitional fuel, as we mentioned before. Later on, we're expecting to have ammonia and hydrogen and also other biofuels, etc. But the main issue for LNG is obviously the price. It's got to be competitive, and you also need to be able to bunker ships when they're carrying out cargo operations, because if ships have to go to special places to bunker LNG, that is going to be costly, because the ships are going to be out of service while they're bunkering, probably having to wait as well. So bunkering barges to bunker ships with LNG are very important. Right, sustainable future for the LNG into the 2030s. Well, basically, if you build a ship today, the cheapest ship is one that's built for oil with an exhaust gas scrubber and using 3.5% heavy fuel. Now, that's old-fashioned, but that is the cheapest ship that you can build today. However, as we mentioned, regulations are coming into force. And if you build a ship today, the end of 2020, it's probably going to take 2 years to deliver. So it'll be delivering the start of 2023, just as all these new environmental regulations start to come into force. So your cheaper ship built today will start to become more expensive as we move towards 2030, and it will be probably becoming very expensive to operate compared with LNG ship, a fueled ship, in 2030 to 2040. So LNG is certainly starting to catch on, particularly for larger ships. It's price competitive. It's actually a lower cost than oil at the moment, and it's expected not to become more expensive than oil. There are some extra capexes for dual fuel engines and LNG storage tanks, etc. But as the technology matures, these will become cheaper. So LNG on its own can't reduce CO2 emissions, but it can reduce them by 15 to 20% at the moment, depending on what type of engine you have. And it will help to meet the 2030 target, there's no doubt about that, but it will not meet the 2050 goal. So how can you meet the 2050 goal? Well, there's possibly LNG, one of the reasons it can continue is that if we can produce LNG from biogas and bio waste and mix it into the current fossil fuel produced LNG, that would increase the reduction of CO2 from LNG between 30 and 35%, which is actually pretty good. But it's not going to produce 50% below, which is what we require by 2050. So some outlook and conclusions. Well, LNG is definitely going to greatly assist shipping to get to the 2030 target, but on its own, it's not going to be able to get to 2050 goal. So zero carbon ship designs are needed by 2025. They're well beyond the current state of the art. We do not have the technology at the moment. There's lots of talk about it. There are some small ships being built at the moment to operate on hydrogen, but they're basically using compressed hydrogen at 350 bar at least. So, and they have to be bunkered for virtually every other day. So this is not the technology which we can use for deep sea shipping, where we have long voyages and we need a lot of fuel. So there's no obvious choice at the moment for alternative fuels, but we think that ammonia, sorry, where's it gone? Oops. Sorry. We think that ammonia is certainly one of the ones that are going to be one of the main ones. But one of the issues for shipping basically is we need to have a level playing field. So what we need is technically proven, safe and commercially sustainable new fuels, and we need regulations. And the IMO is going to produce those regulations. So we're looking forward to having these regulations which can produce a level playing field, which means that everybody can move ahead together and be basically relying on being competitive. So transition to zero carbon fuels is going to be very costly. So how are we going to do that? Well, that means we're going to have to probably go into market-based measures and price carbon. And that also is going to basically mean that oil-fueled ships are going to be basically priced out of the market. Could be in the next 15 years or so. So with that, I would like to conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Martin, for such a comprehensive overview of the international context and the role of LNG as a transition fuel. And this segues nicely into the presentation topic of our next speaker, Mr. Tahir Faruqi, General Manager of Downstream LNG in Shell LNG Marketing and Trading, who will elaborate more on the business case for LNG. Tahir, please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you all share your screen as well?
Yeah, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, it's up. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Distinguished guests, thank you for having me as a member of this esteemed panel. Really enjoyed Mr. Cresswell's presentation. Actually, agree with a lot of the things that he has said, and I'll try to not repeat what he has said, but actually add to that a little bit as well. As already mentioned, my name is Tahir Faruqi, and I'm the global head for downstream LNG at Shell. I sit on Shell's leadership team for global LNG trading. I am truly privileged to be talking to you today. Even with COVID-19 preventing us from meeting in person, I'm sitting here in evening time in Houston. I would have loved to be there in person, but maybe once things settle down, I'll be able to do that shortly. But be that as it may, this has been an extraordinary year, and these are extraordinary times. I'm confident that the human spirit and mankind's resilience will overcome this, and this too shall pass. However, even in the tragedy that has followed this virus, with so many lives lost across the world, we saw something interesting. If you recall, as the world went into lockdown and energy consumption, much to my personal chagrin, came to a grinding halt, we saw something interesting develop. Within days of this shutdown, the environmental impact of such an action became abundantly clear. People could see skylines, mountains became visible. Across the world in key cities, air quality visibly improved. Why am I talking about that? Well, this phenomena made it abundantly clear that we must act now to address the environmental impact of the energy we consume. And for Hong Kong in particular, and for Hong Kong shipping, this is particularly relevant because government data shows that shipping is the biggest source of air pollution. Hong Kong is already taking concrete steps in that regard, with LNG actually coming to this region in 2023. And the ECA regulation that was adapted in 2015 has led to a dramatic reduction in sulfur by up to 30 to 50%. So I just wanted to bring that to bear here. Now let me get started now. I'm going to talk about the pathway to shipping decarbonization. Earlier this year, Shell, with the help of Deloitte, conducted a global study, and we have since published 2 reports that you may have seen. If you haven't, you can go pull them from the website or contact me or my team, and we'd be happy to provide it to you. The first is Decarbonizing Shipping, All Hands on Deck, which was an aggregation of feedback from various and sundry in the shipping sector. And then the second is Decarbonizing Shipping, Setting Shell's Course. Today, I will glean from these studies in my presentation and share some of those insights as well. So starting out, and I think Mr. Cresswell covered a lot of this, so I'll just touch on it briefly. Why are we talking about decarbonization of the shipping sector? We all recognize that shipping is a hard to abate sector, like aviation and a few of the other sectors. However, something must be done, as it is a significant contributor, representing nearly 3% of the global CO2 emissions. And as Mr. Cresswell pointed out, what makes it worse is what's going on the right side of the slide. With a growing global population and increase in demand for energy, for global goods, for global trading, society faces its biggest challenge yet: how to meet this increase in demand while also reducing emissions that contribute significantly to climate change and air quality. Again, the scale of this energy transition required is massive for the world, but also for the shipping sector. Now, I think Mr. Cresswell mentioned that there's 50,000 plus, 55,000 merchant vessels. There's actually 93,000 vessels on the water. Again, the focus for us as well is on the commercial ships because they represent majority of the energy consumption and as a result, the emissions footprint. So the scale and scope is massive. But the challenge to change is that much more difficult because of the underlying fundamentals of this industry. As I've tried to summarize in this slide over here, the switch to a decarbonized solution is going to take time, and it's going to take significant investment. Let's not forget, this sector is just coming out of a major transformation. The industry went through IMO 2020 change, which was challenging in its own right. And as much of a change as that was, the scale needed for the change to get to net zero is going to be that much tougher. Why? Because we're dealing with long asset lifespans, as Mr. Cresswell said. These vessels last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. These are massive assets, so there's high energy dependency, and the complexity of electrification, as well as the industry being used to for the cost of the fuel, makes the transition even more challenging. Add to that the investment cost for adopting new fuels and technologies across the industry, which means converting ships, engines, storage, ports, bunkering. That is the entire value chain that has to get rejuvenated, a cost that this industry will have to bear alone. So while it is a capital intensive industry, shipping costs, when broken down the chain, have reduced significantly and thereby enabling the growth of global trade. So where do we go from here? You may have seen, you may have heard, there are many fuels and technologies being considered for the world of tomorrow. Mr. Cresswell showed a slide which showed all the different options. The possibility landscape is wide at the moment for shipping decarbonization. There are several fuel options being considered, as you see on the left side of this chart. There's green ammonia, green hydrogen, green methanol, bio-LNG, and synthetic fuels. In parallel, there are various technologies being developed, some of which are critical for the adoption of net zero fuels like fuel cells and carbon capture and storage, CCS. As the industry continues to develop the pathways to decarbonize, efficiency technologies that enable shipping to start reducing emissions today. Shell has actually got a proof point of doing that exactly. Working with the University of Southampton, we developed JAWS technology. It's basically a new draft and trim optimization software that has helped reduce emissions on our own ships, existing ships, by up to 7%. And we're excited to be working with Kongsberg Maritime to increase the deployment of JAWS across the industry, not just for ourselves, to help save the consumption of fuel and therefore reduce the emissions. But that's not enough, right? It's chipping away at it a little bit. Bottom line, there is no silver bullet to solve for this problem, but many possibilities are being developed. And it has to be a combination of design, of propulsion capability, of fuel, of the entire supply chain. So where does that leave us for today? The industry must meet the IMO's ambition to at least halve the greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, whilst pursuing efforts towards phasing them out on a pathway to CO2 emissions reduction consistent with the Paris Agreement temperature goals. So the destination is clear. It has to be about net zero emissions. But how we get there is as important. How can the shipping industry support growing global trade, yet not put increased stress on the environment? What emissions can we save today till such a time that the net zero fuel solutions are developed at scale. And also how quickly, which infrastructure and technology investment today will set the sector on a decarbonization journey quicker. So, the course to plot. We must consider 3 sets of actions today to get us on our pathway to decarbonization. And those 3 choices are avoid, reduce, and compensate. First, we must avoid the emissions. Ships are already significantly more efficient than what we produced just a decade ago. Mr. Cresswell showed some data that reflected what the change has been just from 2008 to 2018. However, the possibility to further reduce fuel consumption is still within the realm. Within our organization in shipping and maritime, we've got a technology group that is working on implementing and developing further newer capabilities that take it further. And there continues to be innovation in design and technology that we believe can substantially reduce emissions footprint further. Then, second, we must reduce emissions. There are fuels already available that are significantly better. Mr. Cresswell talked about LNG. Not only does LNG reduce SOx dramatically, sulfur, it also reduces NOx and particulate matter. But it doesn't stop there. LNG can reduce CO2 emissions by up to 20+%. Third, I talked about compensate. We must compensate for the emissions that we end up emitting still. And while the industry invests its resources in developing solutions to avoid and reduce the emissions, there is an option available where we can use high quality carbon credits from nature-based projects to offset the burden that we're creating. So let me talk a little bit about why LNG. There is no fuel available that automatically takes you to net zero emissions. We all agree there. However, as I mentioned earlier, and as Mr. Cresswell has also suggested, there are smart choices you can make today that we believe will actually future-proof your investments for tomorrow. Now remember, I'm sitting here representing Shell, and Shell is a fuel supplier to the world. We supply all kinds of fuels. We will supply you the fuel you want. But we believe that amongst all the fuel choices available, LNG is the best, most capable fuel. Why do we say that? Well, it's not just us. There are several industry experts who are starting to say that as well. And this chart is an illustration from DNV-GL, who's an expert in this space. They've assessed various fuels against what I would consider key criteria to make a global fuel feasible. They look at technical maturity, fuel availability, infrastructure, safety, CapEx requirements, cost, and density. People are talking about ammonia, and Mr. Cresswell showed ammonia in his slides in the 2040 onwards, taking up a share. But let's be clear, it has to be green ammonia. Brown ammonia is 20 times worse than LNG in its emissions profile. While on the ship itself, it doesn't produce emissions, but well to consumption, production to consumption, if you take in all of the emissions, brown ammonia is significantly worse. Not to mention, we have density issues, and not many people want to put ammonia in their vessel. An incident with that molecule in the vessel can, as a fuel, can be catastrophic. Not to mention, there's not much available. People talk about methanol. There is very little infrastructure available to make this fuel a global solution for marine customers. Not to mention, again, there's not much of it. So within these choices, LNG stands out. And as the blue line I've tried to draw on top of DNV-GL's charts shows, LNG is mostly on the right. It stands out as the one fuel that covers all criteria at the top or near the top. It's a prolific fuel that is available globally already. The technology is proven, it is reliable, and the cost of the fuel is competitive. Furthermore, it has the capability to be decarbonized further. Now, Shell recognizes this as a fuel supplier, but remember, we are a user of the fuel as well. Shell has been in the business of shipping from the launch of Shell's first oil tanker, the Murex, in 1892. But today, Shell manages one of the largest fleets of oil, chemical tankers, and liquefied natural gas carriers in the world. And believe it or not, we are adopting our vessels to LNG as we're committing to decarbonize our own footprint. All of our recent charters and new builds since 2018 that Shell is committed to have been on LNG. And we will continue to rejuvenate our fleet to be more LNG. So coming back to the pathways for decarbonization, we believe it starts with LNG. It's a natural step to a more decarbonized world. When you take that first step, you can take LNG and then augment it with as much nature-based solutions as you want to get it to carbon neutral. The second pathway is you take LNG, you add the energy efficiencies that are being developed from a technology and R&D standpoint, and then you augment it with fuel cells, and you can get up to 80% less emissions. You can take LNG plus fuel cells and take it to green hydrogen, and you're at net zero now. And then LNG blended with bio-LNG can get you close to net zero as well. As part of our reports that we have published earlier this year, a key technology to unlock the use of future fuels is actually fuel cells. And LNG is the only fuel available today to help advance this critical technology. Again, let me re-emphasize why we are saying that the world must act now. This is an illustrative slide. It's a busy slide, but let me clear it. What I'm trying to depict here is that inaction is costly. So basically, inaction is in itself an action that is unacceptable, because every day we wait for the perfect solution, we chip away at this finite CO2 budget that we believe gets us to 2050 and the temperature targets that we have at the Paris Agreement. What this chart is simply saying, and it's a very simplified chart, all it's saying is, hypothetically, if we moved all new builds in the coming decade to LNG, the world could save 2.5 billion tons of carbon emissions. That is more than 2 full years of emissions from all of South America. So while LNG is not perfect, it is far better than anything else we can do today. And the impact it can have is substantial. Now, representing Shell, I have to do some shameless promotion as well. But you may call this shameless self-promotion, but I consider this walking the talk. Not only are we converting our own fleet to LNG, we are committing significant investments to build the last mile infrastructure to make LNG available in key ports across the world. Mr. Cresswell showed that their LNG is available at significant number of ports, but most of it is from truck deliveries. What we're investing in is enhancing that capability and adding that last mile, the bunker vessel, to be able to do ship-to-ship operations. And we're growing that footprint at key markets globally. As you may be aware, we were the first ones to provide LNG fuel to the world's first cruise ship powered by LNG and the world's first Aframax. We were also the first one to conduct simultaneous ops for a ship bunkering, proving that marine LNG can operate like marine fuel. And that happened in fall of 2018. Since that time, we have conducted 368 ship-to-ship bunkerings and 204 simultaneous operations. That's through end of last month. And we continue to grow our capability globally and have 7 assets committed to this. And more are coming, many more. We're investing and we're developing that capability at key locations globally. So where does that take us? The Shell Deloitte study clearly laid this out for us. This is a collective problem that we all need to pull together to solve. Collaboration is going to be key to make this change to net zero footprint a success. The shipping industry includes ship owners, shipyards, class societies, financial institutions, regulators, end users of shipping service, etc., etc. All these players need to work together in moving towards the goal of net zero. Decarbonization needs to be the top priority of shipping industry's agenda, and it seems to be creeping up and getting there. Shell is ready and willing to play its part. We're working with others in the industry to look at how all of us can transition to a lower carbon future together. And we'll continue to work with customers as they adopt new fuels and technologies that help reduce emissions. We're also working on decarbonization of our own fleet, as I talked about, but we're also implementing efficiency technologies in those assets as well. And we're continuing to invest in LNG as the cleanest, affordable alternative to traditional marine fuels available right now. With that, I will come to a conclusion. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to me.
All right, thank you, Tahir, for sharing why the shipping industry should invest in LNG. To shift the focus back to Hong Kong and to dive deeper into Hong Kong's very own offshore LNG terminal. Next up, we have Mr. Joseph Law, Senior Director, Planning and Development of CLP Power Hong Kong Limited, to share their views. Joe, please.
Good morning, everyone. I think Martin has demonstrated how the shipping industry needs to change and reduce carbon. And Tahir has eloquently articulated the different fuel possibilities, and LNG being a front-running fuel. And so I'd like to draw the discussion back to Hong Kong and what the opportunity is for Hong Kong to participate in this change. Now, CLP, just by way of introduction, I'm Joseph. I'm from CLP Power, we're a local a utility in Hong Kong that provides 80% of the electricity for Hong Kong's population. So let's dive straight into this. Now, the Hong Kong government has actually set quite clear targets of carbon reduction moving forward. By 2030, Hong Kong would need to reduce its carbon emissions, absolute carbon emissions, by 26%. And by 2050, it would need to go to a net zero position. Now, having the clear target is good. It helps every industry, every citizen, every company in Hong Kong have a clear target. And then we need to work on a roadmap of how to achieve that. Now, for the power sector, the roadmap between now and 2030 is relatively clear. We're basically adopting a three-pronged approach on reducing carbon. Number one is that we are phasing down the use of coal. Number two is that we're increasing the use of gas in power generation. And just increasing the use of gas, it sounds like an easy thing to do, but there are actually a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place in order to make that happen. For example, CLP is building new gas-fired generation units at our power station so that it can consume natural gas as fuel and produce the reliable electricity that we produce every day. And also, we are also developing an offshore LNG terminal in Hong Kong to make sure that the fuel security in Hong Kong is adequate, given the fact that we will be increasing the consumption of natural gas by a significant amount. The third prong approach is actually to increase the use of non-fossil fuels. For example, we're taking landfill gas and producing electricity. We're helping, the government is building waste to energy facilities in Hong Kong, and we're connecting it up to our grid. We're increasing the use of renewable energy, not just by ourselves, but also we're setting out schemes to promote renewable energy use by our customers who have roofs and land that they can put solar panels on. And then we're also enhancing our clean energy transmission system to give Hong Kong the option of importing zero carbon energy from our neighbors. Now, I'd like to, given today's topic is on marine shipping, I'd like to articulate the opportunity for Hong Kong shipping sector to use LNG in Hong Kong. And the reason is that, as I've just explained, Hong Kong will have its own offshore LNG terminal. And we can essentially use that terminal and help the marine sector to use LNG as fuel as well. Now, let me introduce you where that LNG terminal is, and I'll show you a short video to explain how it works. Now, I'm not sure if the map on the next slide will show up or the video will show up first, but just to give you an idea, the offshore LNG terminal is actually located to the south of Lantau Island, off the waters, within the waters of Hong Kong. Here we go. There we go. Now, as you can see, to the south of Lantau, there will essentially be an offshore LNG terminal, which is in the form of a jetty, where there will be a floating storage and regasification unit, a ship that's parked more or less permanently, and then it will allow the LNG cargo ships to come into Hong Kong. And then there'll be two pipelines, one going to the Black Point Power Station of CLP, the other one going to Lama Power Station of Hong Kong Electric. Let me show you a little video of what that offshore LNG terminal looks like. Are you not hearing music? If not, then I'll do an impromptu coverage. So as you can see, the offshore LNG terminal looks like a jetty. It's essentially a jetty. On the right side, you'll see the FSRU ship. So you see the jetty here. And so on one side of the jetty, the FSRU ship would be parked, and it would serve two purposes. One is to store the LNG that's coming in. The other is to regasify the LNG into a gaseous form and send to the pipelines to the two power companies. And then on the other side of the jetty, the LNG cargo ships would come in. So it's a relative. Okay, it's a relatively simple operation. The LNG cargo ship arrives, and the loading arms would attach to it, and the liquid LNG would be transferred onto the FSRU vessel for storage. So after the loading is completed, then the LNG cargo ship can continue with its own voyage back to pick up more cargoes. And this is, as I mentioned, there's a regasification function on the FSRU, and it would basically turn the liquid LNG into gaseous form and transfer to the pipelines to be delivered to the two power companies for their power station use. So that's the Hong Kong offshore LNG terminal. It is under construction right now, and it is expected to be commissioned early 2022. Now, let's get back to the slide. Okay, whoa. Okay, there we go. Apologies about the size, but basically I think Martin has explained that the marine industry is tasked to reduce carbon as well as everybody else, just as everybody else in the world. Now, we're having some, there we go, okay. Now, so all sectors in the community have a responsibility to reduce carbon, and the marine sector is no different. I won't go through the different regulations that are coming on the horizon, as Martin has elaborated that well. I think the key point on this slide is to keep in mind that by 2030, the marine sector is expected to reduce carbon by 40%. By 2050, it's expected to reduce carbon by 70%. And LNG is actually a front-running fuel to help make that happen. Okay, now LNG not only provides the carbon reduction benefits, it actually virtually eliminates sulfur dioxide and particulate matters emissions. Okay, and it would reduce NOx emissions by 95%. So it doesn't only have a carbon benefit, but it also has significant air pollution reduction benefits as well. Now, looking at, you've just seen how the LNG cargoes come into Hong Kong. Now, how does LNG bunkering work in Hong Kong, or how would it work? Essentially, the upstream part would remain the same. The LNG cargo ship on the left would come in, deliver the cargo to the FSRU. Now, what needs to happen from there on is that there will need to be a bunkering vessel or vessels in Hong Kong. They're much smaller in size compared to the FSRU. The FSRU is, in volume terms, is it can hold 265,000 cubic meters of LNG, and the LNG bunkering vessels typically around 7,500. So that's the scale we're looking at. Now, the LNG bunkering vessel, what it does is it will park onto the other side of the jetty and receive LNG from the FSRU unit. And what it would do is basically shuttle to the end user, who are the vessels, the container ships, the cruise ships that are parked elsewhere in Hong Kong, Kwai Chung Terminal, wherever. And what it needs to happen is that LNG bunkering vessel would deliver that LNG to the end customer and refuel the end customer vessels. Now, for Hong Kong, and actually for most places, as Martin has explained, a lot of the refueling is done by truck, which is not an efficient means. And in particular for a dense place like Hong Kong, that's next to impossible to do if you have thousands of trucks shuttling around in the already busy roads in Hong Kong. Now, what is the more efficient way of doing it, and it's actually the common way, will become the common way of doing it, is by a ship-to-ship transfer. So that LNG bunkering vessel you see in red here, what it needs to do is needs to park right next to the customer vessel. And then as the customer vessel is doing its own thing, unloading passengers, unloading container cargos, the refueling would happen right by its side. And there are increasing number of ports who can do ship-to-ship transfer operations in the world, because that's simply the most efficient way of doing it. Now that we have an LNG terminal in Hong Kong, I would say there are three things that needs to happen in order to make LNG bunkering be available and happening in Hong Kong. Number one is that, actually before I explain the three key elements, I think an important point to note is that the whole marine industry is moving towards LNG as a key fuel. Now, and there are many ports who are developing LNG bunkering capabilities. Now, Hong Kong has been an important and the world's busiest ports at one time. And with this global shift, we believe that if Hong Kong can offer LNG bunkering services, it will help Hong Kong retain its competitiveness as an international port globally. Now, what needs to happen in Hong Kong to have LNG bunkering materialize? We see three essential factors. Number one is that we need the relevant marine policy and regulations in place to allow this to happen, to regulate how the LNG bunkering activities would operate safely, and to allow the ship-to-ship transfer and the simultaneous operations to happen. The second thing is there will be a minor modification needed on the jetty itself. And the third thing is that there needs to be a bunkering vessel in Hong Kong to take the LNG from the terminal to the end users. And as I've just explained, Hong Kong was the busiest and most successful marine port globally. It's now still in the top 10, and in the future we see that LNG bunkering refueling capability would be a key element to help Hong Kong maintain that position. So in summary, CLP is doing what we can to decarbonize the electricity sector. And given we have this LNG terminal facility, we believe it can also be put to good use by helping the marine sector reduce carbon. Offering LNG marine fuel in Hong Kong can enhance the competitiveness of Hong Kong ports, and we need full support from the industry as well as the government to have the relevant policies in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, for the very informative presentation on Hong Kong's offshore LNG terminal and its possible application in the local context. Now it is the time for our panel discussion with three speakers, Martin, Tahir, Joe, and they will be joined by Mr. Simon Ng, Director of Policy and Research here at BEC, who will be moderating today's discussion. friendly reminder, if you have any questions for the speakers, please feel free to type them out using the Q&A function. Thank you. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Wayne. And so first of all, I would like to thank the three speakers for their excellent and insightful presentations. And I also want to welcome and thank the 133 participants joining us online this morning. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation so far. But now in the next 25 minutes or so, we will hopefully have another very interactive and interesting conversation on LNG. Now, since Joe, you have to leave early because of an urgent meeting, so maybe I will ask you the first question, if I may.
Sure.
You mentioned, Joe, that with the new LNG terminal ready for use in a year or so, you see the opportunity, for providing LNG bunkering as one of the ways to decarbonize the shipping sector. Especially recently, the government announced, that Hong Kong is committed to become carbon neutral by 2050, and also not just focusing on carbon reduction, but air pollution problem. LNG will go a long way to reduce air pollution here in Hong Kong. You mentioned some modification. You mentioned a few steps that needs to be done. Just a quick question about whether that requires another EIA for the jetty modification. And also in terms of the conversation with governments, you talk about marine policy. It probably has to involve Marine Department, Transport and Housing Bureau, and maybe even other government bureaus. Have you started the conversation with them, or did they approach you to start talking about LNG as a possible transition fuel?
Yeah. Thank you, Simon, for the question. I think as you understand, we've just started the construction for the LNG terminal, and we have a few years to go before it commissions. And then, so I think it's a good time now to start that conversation with the different government departments. I think what we need to do is for the industry and the government to work together to learn from best practices from other places. There are other ports who have done it before, they've done it well. And what we need to do together is to look at the best practices from overseas and bring in the best practices to Hong Kong to make sure that LNG bunkering in Hong Kong can happen and can happen in a safe and effective manner.
Okay, so your last point is about being safe as well, because ultimately this is very important. So it has to also involve like EMSD, because they have a team looking at gas safety issues. So how important is to bring in these are government departments, not just the policy bureaus, but also the government departments into the conversation?
I think the industry and the government needs to work together. Different parts of the government needs to work together to make this happen. Now, bearing in mind the LNG industry, and Tahir can attest to it, the LNG industry has been operating for over 40 years and with an impeccable safety record. So I don't see that as an issue, but we just need to ensure that safety record is upheld. We bring the best practices into Hong Kong and make sure everything is done in the proper manner. And that would give the confidence to the industry and the government and to the Hong Kong community as well.
Okay. So you mentioned Tahir. So Tahir, well, thank you for joining us from Houston. Actually, I have a question from the audience also asking about safety issues. The question states that there's a lot of news about oil leakage incidents that impact ocean environment from bunker ship. Will LNG actually provide less impact to the ocean if such incident happen? Now, so maybe in terms of the safety records of LNG operation, at sea. So that's my first question, if you can share. And then secondly, if anything happened in terms of the impact, would that be any difference compared to, oil leakage?
Yeah, I think what Joe said is critical context, that LNG is not a new fuel. LNG is not a new commodity. It has a very long track record, 40 plus years of global movement of molecules all over. And so far, touch wood, it's been an impeccable safety record. But by no means should we take the handling of LNG lightly. We, Shell, as I had mentioned in my presentation, have opened up a few of these locations that are now doing LNG bunkering, and we worked with Port of Rotterdam, Port of Singapore, Barcelona. We're doing it in Spezia in Italy. We've got many locations where we are operating, and we worked with the local authorities in helping define what the regulations need to be, but the handling procedures. And if you handle it well, then it ends up being a very safe molecule to deal with, but it needs to be handled properly. Now, coming to your question, oil spills are bad for the environment, no question, because the interaction of an oil molecule with the ecosystem ends up being quite damaging for a long period of time. LNG is a different type of molecule. It's liquefied, but it's liquefied at a very, very cold temperature. So it's being held at minus 160 degrees centigrade, right, when it's on a ship. And if, God forbid, a spill does happen, if it gets out of its containment and onto the water, which is where oil spills tend to be harmful, it will naturally start warming up because it is no longer in its contained environment. So very quickly, it will warm up and it will start vaporizing. And as it vaporizes, it will actually escape into the environment. So its interaction with the ocean and the ecosystem around it is very short term, and it's actually not harmful to the ocean. However, let's not forget, an incident will still be a bad outcome, because as it converts into methane and it evaporates into the environment, it will actually be detrimental to the objective we are trying to get to, which is further decarbonize the world. So methane leaking into the environment would be a bad outcome. But from a safety standpoint, from an incident standpoint, and a permanent damage to the ecosystem in the oceans and the surrounding areas, the LNG molecule will just behave very differently from an oil molecule, and will have almost no impact on its surrounding areas.
Well, thank you, Tahir. Not good that you mentioned methane slip, and I will come back to you later on this particular topic, because I think this is very important for LNG as a fuel. But before you go, Joe, that's one question specifically for you. If LNG is to become a mandated marine fuel for Hong Kong, do you think the one LNG terminal will be sufficient to support both electricity generation and ship bunkering needs?
I think what I can say is that I think it will take time for adoption of new fuel, for any new fuel. There are many ships in Hong Kong, so and many ships will have to go through its life cycle. So I think it would be a gradual change, number one. And number two, it would be a good problem to have. If there's so much demand that exceeds what the one terminal can handle, then maybe we will need to find another way to meet that additional demand.
Yeah, certainly. I think it makes a lot of sense, but unfortunately, we're still some way to go to have LNG being recognized as a mandated fuel, I guess. But I think that's why we have to have this event, and also we have to, as you said, working closely with the industry, with the government, to make sure that this will happen. So I thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
And Martin, related to my last point, how would you say in terms of the industry's position right now? Because you mentioned in your presentation, LNG will be a major fuel for ships in the future. What about, with your associations, your members, and what's your view in terms of the progress in terms of pushing for LNG bunkering here in Hong Kong? Because I know you had, and your association had some conversation with the government before. So can you share a little bit about where you are right now?
Well, certainly the Hong Kong Shipowners Association has been talking to government. In fact, we've been putting into the policy speech of the CE the last few years, actually, to push for LNG bunkering in Hong Kong. But from a sort of economics point of view now, if you just look at the cost of LNG, I mean, basically from a energy point of view, there was actually a very good article yesterday produced by Gibson on the economics of the side of LNG. And basically what they were saying is that LNG at the moment is about $250 a ton, whereas fuel costs at the moment, oil is about $350. Depends on the type of fuel, but it's about $100 difference. So if you just took a VLCC, which burns about 50 tons of fuel a day, saving for that ship per day on LNG is something like about $8,000 a day, equates to about $3 million a year. The cost of putting a dual fuel engine and LNG tanks into a tanker actually is about somewhere in 14 million a year, sorry, 40 million capex. So you're talking about a sort of 5-year payoff. So that is without any regulation, without any carbon tax put in at all. So that is why large ships, large container ships, tankers, passenger ships, etc., which burn lots of fuel, they're looking very seriously at dual fuel operations with LNG. So, but smaller ships, it's more difficult because of the difference in the capex tends to be a larger proportion of the total capex of the ship. So it's not quite so good at the moment. But as soon as you have a carbon price put in, that will change considerably because that will push the LNG price even lower compared with the oil, which will have a higher cost. So the Gibson point there was basically if you just took a carbon price of $300, that pushes the LNG well up. We're talking about almost $30,000 a day lower cost compared with oil. So there's absolutely no question at all that basically any new ships at that sort of level, you would go for LNG, even for smaller ships. So Hong Kong is a big container port. We also have tankers coming here, and we also have passenger ships coming here. So actually there is a lot of opportunity in the future for LNG bunkering for these ships. And if we don't have LNG bunkering here, there's a possibility that some of these ships will decide not to come to Hong Kong, which will impact the economics of Hong Kong's as a whole.
Okay. Well, actually, I have another question written down exactly about your last point. If Hong Kong, choose not to develop LNG bunkering in the near future, what will be the cost to Hong Kong as a major seaport? Are you aware of any research or even government studies with internally to try to quantify?
I haven't seen any research, but I think that, as I pointed out in my presentation, you need almost sort of 1.6 times the tankage on a ship for LNG compared with oil. So basically you need to bunker more frequently because you don't want to have that extra tankage and reduce your cargo carrying capacity. So if we don't have LNG bunkering in Hong Kong, it's quite probable that there'll be fewer ships coming here which actually burn LNG because they'll just say, well, we need to bunker here. We haven't got any bunkering facilities, so we'll have to go somewhere else.
Okay. And Tahir, what would you say to the Hong Kong government on this particular issue, LNG bunkering? You should do it, and why? And it seems like we have to have a very serious conversation with the government because it's critical in terms of decarbonizing the sector, but also thinking about Hong Kong, part of Hong Kong's long-term competitiveness. So what would you suggest to us if we are going to start a conversation with the government.
So I agree with Mr. Cresswell. I think simple fact is the economics of a LNG bunkering operation justify Hong Kong offering LNG bunkering. Now, you're 90% there because you're going to be receiving LNG on the conventional terminal so the infrastructure is already there. It's about adding that last mile, which is a bunker vessel, which is, people like Shell are very keen to develop the global network, because part of the dilemma, as Simon has said, is you need the global network to be able to offer LNG. So just having it available in Singapore and Rotterdam is not going to be enough. You need it in at least the top 10, 15 key ports. Hong Kong is a key port. So for LNG bunkering to really become a mainstream solution, Hong Kong needs to be able to offer it. But the flip side is, I agree with Mr. Cresswell that by offering it, you make Hong Kong a more compelling location for these vessels. Because make no mistake, over the next 10, 15 years, the new build ships that are coming will have to consider what the future fuel is. And you've already seen the order build that was shown earlier. More and more vessels are moving towards LNG. And if Hong Kong, which has the capability to offer LNG, doesn't offer it for the maritime sector, it will miss out on that opportunity. But remember, in my kickoff, I had also mentioned that Hong Kong not only will benefit economically by offering LNG, there's a unrelated but incidental benefit, because LNG is a cleaner fuel and the marine emissions at the port of Hong Kong are a significant contributor to Hong Kong's air quality. Air quality has been proven to be a significant impact on health for the local population. So again, I'm not making a long leap here. You can look at various studies where there is a very strong correlation to health costs and air quality in major cities. Hong Kong being no different from any of those others. So by choosing to adopt LNG for bunkering, you automatically look to clean up the air and the environment around the port, around the island, which will have a direct impact on the health of the population as well. So you have a direct economic impact, but you have an indirect effect not from decarbonization, but from other benefits of LNG as a fuel being consumed in and around the environment for Hong Kong.
Yeah, certainly, Tahir, thank you. Of course, air quality is, something that, Hong Kong people aspire to. And I think even though we've improved in terms of air quality in the last few years, there's still room to further improve. So definitely we have to, in Hong Kong, look into the shipping sector and how to, make it cleaner and, produce less carbon. Now, back to my earlier questions to you about methane slip. Are there any solutions to solve that problem? Because it's not just about, methane slip during operation. It's like the entire, supply chain are facing similar issues. So Tahir, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it's a good one to put on the table, because there's a lot of people who talk about LNG and it being good but not good enough, and part of the reason is because of methane slip. And there's two areas, as you rightly pointed out, where methane slip happens. One is in the vessel itself, and then the other is in the supply chain upstream of the vessel. So during consumption, the engine technology that was available, that was dealing with LNG being converted into methane molecules in a gaseous state and then being combusted, there were some fugitive emissions that would escape, not being fully burned based on how the engine was configured. Well, good news is there's now engine technology available from OEMs and that are already being installed in shipyards today, where it eliminates methane slip on the ship. Now, coming back to the upstream side of things, the analysis and the studies that reflect what upstream emissions look like is a static view of what historical operations have been. Remember, this was not an issue recognized as being an issue for a long period of time. So upstream operations weren't necessarily paying attention to it. There was flaring and all of that happening, which coincidentally ended up being detrimental to the environment. We now know that a lot of the upstream industry is looking at it. They are now looking to measure where leaks may happen, where emissions may be happening. And there is a conscious effort to actually capture, reduce, or eliminate these methane fugitive emissions being escaped from upstream emissions. So Shell, for example, we have made a commitment that by 2025, we will reduce our upstream emissions down to 0.2%, right? We're going to cut it dramatically. But it's not just about Shell. It's about the industry. It's about how do upstream operations happen. And I think there is an increasing recognition that that needs to be addressed. As that gets addressed, for the shipping industry, they have to do nothing more. If they've adopted LNG, just by the fact that they've adopted LNG and the upstream investment happens to eliminate or reduce emissions, the carbon footprint improves for LNG, and the performance improves for LNG relative to alternate fuels. So it's something that is recognized as an issue. On the vessel, it's being addressed with the new engine technology. Upstream, it's being addressed and should help alleviate the methane slip issue. It doesn't eliminate it. So LNG still does not get you to net zero. It still has, it will still have a carbon footprint just by the nature of how it gets produced and delivered and consumed. But it can substantially be improved versus what we've known historically, at least to date.
Thank you to hear. That's very encouraging to hear. Now I have a question for Martin. What's the best ship propulsion engine type in terms of GHG reduction, greenhouse gas reduction, and what percentage of the current commercial ships are having these type of engine?
Well, the only low greenhouse gas fuel at the moment actually is LNG. I mean, there aren't any others. We're talking about hydrogen, and we're talking about green hydrogen, green ammonia, etc. But those fuels are not available yet on a commercial basis for deep sea shipping. So we're only talking about LNG. And
so what percentage of current commercial ship fleet?
Well, it's very small. I mean, if we're talking about, I mean, when we talk about ships, there's always numbers. Like I mentioned 55,000 ships. It's 55,000 ships over 1,000 GRT. So basically eliminating all the smaller ships, but 95,000 international ships totally, which include all the smaller ships. But when you talk about the 55,000, which are the large ships, we're talking about a very small number at the moment. We've got about well, if we got 227 at the moment on order, and we've got 200 in service. So not including the LNG tankers. So we're still only talking about less than 500.
Okay.
Totally. So which is a very small number. So right. there's a massive amount of growth needs to be there to really lower the sector, the whole of the sector, because we're talking about, when we're talking about 2030 reducing by 40% CO2 intensity, which is basically ton miles CO2. That's talking about international shipping. So we're talking about still a lot to go to get to that target.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. Now we only have 3 more minutes. I have 2 questions from the audience that I'd like to address. The first one is about domestic ships. So we're not talking about ocean-going large vessels, but the use of LNG for smaller vessels. I remember, Martin, you talk about the economics of for smaller vessels to use LNG. maybe it's not that attractive and efficient. But, you know, in some areas, I think they do have small ships, you know, having an LNG tank on top of the deck, and then like in Yangtze River Delta region, I think that's the case. And so what's your thoughts? Are there any potential for domestic ships to use that?
Well, I think, yes, in China, they actually have a program for this, but I think they've also realized that on small ships, generally, you're using 4-stroke engines, not 2-stroke engines. And the 4-stroke engine does have a larger methane slip than the 2-stroke engine, quite a bit larger. So actually, they're moving into things like methanol, in green methanol, and also LPG. So it's not just, I don't think you're going to see a very huge number of small domestic ships in China, for instance, or even in Europe or wherever, changing over to LNG because of the issues of methane slip on 4-stroke with 4-stroke engines.
Okay, I see. Tahir, do you agree with that? Any successful cases in other parts of the world?
There's definitely cases where smaller ships have moved towards LNG. I would tend to agree with Martin that I think where the current capability is and the focus is, it's really about where the majority of the consumption is happening, which is creating majority of the emissions footprint. And that's really in the deep sea international shipping sector. But that said, I mean, Shell itself just placed an order for inland barges, 40 of them, to go up and down the Rhine from Rotterdam to Cologne. And they will, to eliminate the methane slip issue, it's a combination of electric drive and LNG. We've done offshore service vessels in the US off the Gulf of Mexico that we put on charter, and then we see ferries operating in Northern Europe and in actually also in the Mediterranean. So you see cases of those, but again, those are few and far in between given the number of vessels that are in operation. Doesn't mean LNG doesn't work for them. It's just, I think, a combination of economics and having the right engine technology to be able to eliminate the methane slip that will be in the vessels. I forgot to mention there are actually the container ships owned by CMA. They're also on LNG now. Technically, they're not small ships, but they're still regional in operation. They're not international in operation, and they're running on LNG quite successfully as well.
Right.
So there are cases, there are examples, but I think more technological improvement needs to happen to further improve and eliminate the methane slip on those engines.
Okay. So Tahir, the last question is for you. So very quickly, you mentioned LNG plus nature-based offsets can lead to carbon neutral. What would be the size or amount of the offsets you're talking about? Maybe in percentage? I don't know.
Yeah, so again, that's a choice, right? Because there's no regulation forcing any level of percentage. So we know there are some customers have chosen, like the cruise sector, they are particularly being pushed by their customers, not by regulators, to have a greener footprint. So they have purchased these nature-based solutions offsets to compensate for that, but that's very much a voluntary ambition, and it's more driven by how many of their customers are asking for their journey to be carbon neutral, so they just adjust based on that. But you can go up to 100%, because the nature-based solutions are available. We at Shell are also building a portfolio to make sure that these are credible nature, because you have to make sure these projects are managed properly to make sure that these nature-based offsets actually stay and persist for the life of the offset promised. So we're building these forests and developing these forests and protecting them ourselves. But there's many of those available, and it's a function of just how much a ship owner or a charterer wants to offset.
Okay, thank you, Tahir. To conclude, I think we've heard from different sectors, from the shipping sector. We heard from fuel suppliers and also the utility company owning or building a LNG terminal facilities. And it seems like LNG has been considered as a feasible option for the shipping sector moving forward. And BEC will continue to work on our projects on LNG bunkering. And as we mentioned earlier at this event, we will have the second part of this webinar series, possibly in the first quarter of next year. And we will share with you some of our research findings and also maybe go deeper into the regulatory framework that's required for LNG bunkering to happen here in Hong Kong. Before that, then I would like to thank all the speakers. Tahir from Houston, thank you so much for joining us late at night. And Martin, thank you for joining. And of course, also thank you, Joe, for joining us earlier on. With that, I would like to close the webinar. Thank you for staying with us until our next event. I wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and see you next year. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.